My name is Ky'okusinga Kirunga, and I am a field representative here at the Stephen Lewis Foundation. And this means that I visit, the large part of my work is to visit organizations in one of the 15 countries where we fund in sub-Saharan Africa. And I visit organizations, either organizations that have applied to us for funding, to evaluate the work and make sure that they fit in with our funding mandate and ethos. I also visit organizations that we are currently funding to monitor the projects, to make sure that everything is going the way it should be going, to visit the beneficiaries, and to learn more about the impact of the work that the impact that their work is having in their communities and wherever else they work. And to continue building on the relationship that we have started, to strengthen whatever ties we have, to learn from them in a way that will inform us, not only going forward with them as organizations, but also that will inform us generally in the work that we do, because it's an ongoing process, it's an ever-changing process, it's an ever-evolving process, and it requires us to learn from the work and infuse that into the way we deal with all these organizations. So that's a very brief summary of my job. And I'll talk, I guess, a little bit about the way in which we work, the way that it's so special, the way it seems to be so meaningful on the ground with the organizations that we're funding. I think one of the most special things is that we visit each and every organization before we fund them, and that we also visit them during the relationship of funding. This is so important in so many ways, and sometimes difficult to quantify and sometimes difficult to talk about, but it's so meaningful for these organizations that we take the time to go visit them and spend a day. And most of them are far-flung, rurally based organizations that never get visitors, that hardly get any funding. So the act of going there is a great honor for them and really makes their work seem legitimate. Even if we don't end up funding them in the end, it just is such a meaningful addition to the work that they do. And also, I think particularly meaningful is once we have funded an organization, is that we work as partners with them. So there might be some things that need work, but we won't cut off an organization because they don't have a qualified accountant. We won't cut off an organization because they don't have a professionally trained project coordinator. But we work together with them to make sure that they can meet what we need on our end, because we are obviously beholden to the Canadian Revenue Agency's rules and regulations. But in so doing, it meets our needs, but it also builds the capacity of the people who work there. So the person might not be an accountant who's doing the work, but will learn the professional way of doing this sort of work. So it's very meaningful for building their capacity. It's extremely meaningful for us at the foundation because we work directly in the field. We fund organizations thousands of miles away. It's really important for us to learn about the context that they're working within each community, because it is unique, and there's so many communities that make up larger communities, there's so many larger communities that make up countries. So it's really important to get a good understanding of what happens in their area, why it's so important for them to have whatever they might be asking for, and for that to inform us to be a responsible donor. That's, like, I suppose, a bigger picture of it also, but to understand their work so that we can really fine-tune the support we're giving them and let that inform us as we go along. So it's a great privilege to be able to, because every trip I've done, probably visited about 100 organizations by now, and every trip is different, every organization is different, every community is different. The basic needs always remain the same, but it's an incredible learning experience for us to be, and a great privilege really, to be able to see the work firsthand and not just rely on paper and reports and emails and the odd phone call. And it has made the Stephen Lewis Foundation a very special donor. It has meant that we have incredible relationships with great mutual respect, trust with the organizations that we're working with, and has built us up as well as an organization. So it's a wonderful way in which we do the work. Yes, I'll talk about the grandmothers. The grandmothers are an incredible group of women across the continent, and it's so great that the foundation has been such a leader on this end of the world as a donor in really championing for these grandmothers who have taken on such an incredible burden and continue to do so, because people are still dying, children are still being orphaned, and they're almost all of them being taken care of by their grandmothers as best as their grandmothers can in their twilight years. The burden is amazingly humbling and difficult to witness, and for us to have caught on to that need so early on and to respond to it, and to respond to it in such a communal way. So it's not just the foundation, but it's the foundation working with thousands of grandmothers across Canada to support grandmothers in Africa is really so very meaningful. But the grandmothers are really laboring under a heavy, heavy burden. I see grandmothers almost every visit I go. I don't think I've ever not visited a grandmother, even if the project that we're funding is not specifically a grandmother's group. You inevitably fund grandmothers because grandmothers are tied into every reaction and every response to the pandemic on the ground. And the grandmothers are amazing because they largely do not complain. They do this with so much love in their hearts. They are under such stress, they often don't have access to what they need to cope with the situation. And yet they go on, and yet they take on another grandchild, and they'll take on a neighbor who dies' grandchild. And so they're doing the best they can to hold the community together, to hold their families together, but it's really difficult. I remember so well a grandmother I saw in a few months ago in March when I was in Zambia, living in a slum just outside the main city, Lusaka. And she was living in a shack, and she was quite old, and she had recently been diagnosed with breast cancer. Plus she had, the usual physical ailments that come with a woman of that age living the life that she is. And she had 4 children in her care. One was a tiny little guy who was 2 years old. None of them were in school. One was in and out of school, but mostly out of school because he was hungry. There was no food in the house. And when I got there, she was cooking maybe 2 cups of beans in the middle of her floor. And I asked her if they'd eaten that day, and they hadn't eaten. So they were waiting for the evening to have that 1 cup of beans split between the 5 of them. And that was going to be the only meal for the day. And the roof was leaking, so everybody was sharing a single bed. And it was just dismal, and this organization that we have since funded was going to be working with grandmothers like that to re-roof their houses, to ensure that they have food security, to make sure the kids are going to school, to make sure that they have basic medical care, so the grandmother will get at least some of her basic medical needs met, and the kids will be in school and they will be fed. And it was going to be huge for her, because if she had carried on like that, she probably wasn't going to live many more months, and then what was going to happen to the children? And she's just one example of hundreds of thousands of grandmothers who are living this life. And so the support that they're getting through the Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign here at the foundation is so meaningful. And even if it can't reach all the grandmothers, just the idea that grandmothers are being supported because they really are the backbone of keeping these generations alive is meaningful. And they love the idea that Canadian grandmothers are doing all this work to respond to their needs. And they ask me all the time, why do they do this? And why do they care so much about us? And how do they know about what we're living through? It's really so meaningful on a personal level for the African grandmothers. And I have the privilege of living in Canada and working in Africa, so seeing both sides of that campaign. And the Canadian grandmothers are also incredible in their responses, and they're not there every day. They're not driven by daily pictures of people suffering, people dying. It's an instinctive reaction, I suppose, as grandmothers to their sisters, and understanding what it would mean for them to be looking after 7 children with no pension, hardly a home, having to pay school fees. And it's a beautiful story. It's a beautiful story to witness the African grandmothers so excited and saying, please hug all the Canadian grandmothers for us. And the Canadian grandmothers being so excited to know that what they're doing is helping, is making a difference, is having an impact, and creating that bond between Canadian grandmothers. There's no such a thing as the British grandmothers or the American grandmothers. It's always the Canadian grandmothers, and I think that's really special and making a huge, huge difference. Yes. Well, I think every grandmother's home, or any home really that's been impacted by HIV and AIDS, the needs are, it's always education for the children. Always. Everybody talks about education for the children. Everybody talks about secure access to food, sustainable access to food. And then third is usually clothing or medical, being able to go to the hospital if you have malaria, or if you have a bad flu or that sort of thing, or access to medical care. Those are always the basic needs, and I've heard them in every single country I've been in, whether it's grandmothers or any other caregiver, is school fees, food, and then shelter and medical care.
And could you talk a bit about the work from a personal perspective and what it means to you, what gives you hope doing this really difficult work, and what the challenges are of doing the work?
Well, I guess starting with the very, very, very personal, I am Ugandan, originally from Uganda, born there and lived there for the first few years of my life. I've lived in Kenya, I've lived in Lesotho, all countries that the foundation is currently funding in, and then I've lived in Canada most of my life, and I'm a Canadian as well. So this job is a perfect bridge, or I guess web or meeting place, nexus of all the persons and all the things that I am personally. So it's very enriching to be on the ground, to meet African women who are my age and seeing what they're living through on a daily basis, and then coming here and being one of the team in a Canadian foundation and doing the work that we do. It's just so, I guess it's a greater personal impetus for me in the work. Being from Uganda means it's one of the hardest hit countries by the pandemic, so I've lost many family members, close family members, to AIDS, and so what that was like before, 10 years ago, before we got to the point where we are, when people were dying and access to medication was just non-existent, when the social support networks weren't built, so there was no support groups, the stigma levels were through the roof. It was a really difficult time to be HIV positive, and so I've seen that it's touched my life personally, and to be involved in efforts to turn that is really deeply meaningful for me. It fulfills sort of everything that I am, I guess. Yeah, I do like the turning the tide phrase or title or whatever we're calling it, because it's not just about us establishing hope where there's none. It really is about us calling it what it is today. I think people are empowered, people are looking forward, and that is what gives me hope. I think we talked about that, or you asked the question, what gives me hope is seeing that the tide is being turned. It might be slow, it might be starting really at the grassroots level, it might take a while to rise to the level where it needs to be, but it is happening, it's happening every day, and it's happening when you see grandmothers becoming advocates and pushing government for access to proper medication, school fees and grants for the kids, and housing grants. That is turning the tide. It's not lying down, nursing a few wounds and hoping for a semi-dignified death. It's getting up and making sure that not only are we eating today, but we will be in school tomorrow and in 10 years' time, and this generation will be able to be self-reliant. And you see the stories all the time of children who were left destitute after their parents dying, and organizations stepping in to support them, and they are now self-reliant, have jobs, support their siblings, and are not rich, but they are making it, and it means that them and their siblings are covered for the next many generations to come. And that's what it's about, stepping in now so that in 20 years time, 40 years time, the difference is made. I always think of a group of women that I met in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, who we've been funding for I think 3 or 4 years now, and I was lucky enough to go 2 years in a row, so I was able to see what the project funding meant from one year to the next. And so the one year they were getting money to start small income generating projects just so they can be self-reliant. And the next year, when I went over a year later, their businesses were running, and and all the women who had met the year before insisted on coming to meet me a year later because everybody wanted to tell me for themselves what they were now doing. And most touching for me was hearing them say, now we can eat. Now we eat 3 meals a day. The kids have a good breakfast before they go to school. They have lunch and they have supper, and I do that. And it was an incredible story of restoring dignity. So everybody wants to be able to feed their dependents and make sure they got off to school in the way they should. And these women were able to do that through their small businesses and thinking ahead and thinking of reinvesting. And it wasn't big sums of money, but that was a tide turning. That was changing lives actively within a 12-month period and ensuring that they're self-reliant and that their children will certainly be self-reliant. It was one of the most touching meetings I've ever been in, and so celebratory and excited and, seemingly not very important, but really it is at the heart of humanity. You need to meet the needs of your dependents, and to me, that is turning the tide.